Hey team, welcome to the session on Coffee with Prab. And today we have a special guest, my brother Krish. And soon you can see coffee series from Krish also. We have done two sessions on CCSP Domain 1 and Domain 2, and I'm sure it provide you great insights about this domain. We are back again with the domain 3, as domain 3 is basically most important, most difficult domain. And I've seen a lot of people failed in the CCSP because of the domain 3 and domain 6. So I thought let's spend more time on the domain 3 and let's understand what is required for you to understand and prepare for this exam from a domain 3 point of view. Hi Krish, over to you.
Hey Prab, hi. Hi everyone. This is Krish. So happy to be back. So today we are back with the domain 3 of the CCSP exam, that is cloud platform and infra security. And like what Prab said, this domain is one of the most hassling domain for people for sure because of multiple reasons. And the most important reason is that the perspective you must have for this domain. Like for a routine cloud course, when you learn, you're talking about the cloud service customer perspective, you're talking about the IaaS services, PaaS service and all. But this domain is talking about the cloud service provider, mostly their perspectives, their infrastructure. And also obviously this needs a bit more kind of a different perspective of preparation and more intense knowledge on that. I
I
agree with Prab
agree.
on that. Yeah.
I agree also. So one thing is that team, like when it comes to this domain, okay, one thing you need to understand is, see, if you take example of CSSP, in CSSP, all the eight domains you have a visibility because that's something you have seen in your day-to-day activity. But when it comes to in CCSP, domain one is more like conceptual domain to talk about data security because you have a control over your data. But how things works on the cloud provider side, you are working for the company who are into data center services, cloud services, and then you have a visibility, it makes sense. But if you're working on the client side and they're using a third party cloud, then this is more like a imagination for you. So that is the reason that this domain is difficult for those folks who have never seen data centers, never seen architecture, never seen networks, network architectures and all that. Correct me if I'm wrong, Krish.
Exactly. Like you need to have a very good knowledge about the virtualization, the underlying infrastructure, the fire safety kind of concepts. You must be aware of the concept of networking, like VLANs. A lot of things we have to learn as it all together if you want to basically understand this domain. For sure, yes.
So in this domain, if you go by the syllabus, it covers 17%. As I said, do not go by the 17% because somehow the domain 3, cloud platform and infrastructure security, questions will start from domain 1, answer will be from domain 3, questions start from domain 5, answer will be on domain 3. So according to the IC square statistics, 17% is basically testable from this particular domain. Do you have any pointers to tell Krish here?
Exactly. That is one thing I see about CCSP also is that like there is no questions I feel that is specific to one domain. That every question is mixed up. It's coming from multiple domains for sure. Like you said, one question can be from a domain number three, and the answer can be from domain one. Like it's always a mixed up kind of thing. That's indeed a thing for sure.
So if you go by this domain, first part of the domain we talk about is comprehend cloud infrastructure and platform components. Okay, in which we have a topics around physical environment, network and communication, compute virtualizations, storage and management planes. So Krish, do you wish to start something?
Of course, yes. Like team, this domain, as I said before, this is more talking about the cloud service provider, how the cloud service provider is providing the infrastructure. And starting with the first one called as the physical environment, there are multiple factors we have to keep in mind. Like for example, let's say we are talking about storing a data somewhere. Like we are deploying a data center somewhere. When we are planning about deploying data center somewhere, we have to make sure that we must have a complete understanding of the location of our data center, then the environmental conditions there, the ability to get the power supply, the network connectivity, and all these kind of things, the resiliency options and all these things. So that is something which we have to learn, very important, starting with the first one called as a physical environment. Then talking about network and communications, that's also is very important, where we have to understand the concept of SDN. SDN is a very important topic you have to learn
I
because
agree.
yeah, when you work in a data center, for sure, SDN is what it is unavoidable because when you handle a small network, like let's suppose that you're having a network of 10 routers or 10 firewalls, etc. It's very simple. You can manage it by yourself. But if you want to manage a massive amount of network or a kind of data center kind of stuff, SDN and software-defined virtualization or network-defined virtualization is very important for you to understand for sure in the network perspective, because that is what we do in reality. Like when you go to any data centers, you will see SDN for sure, like if either from Cisco or any company in this, but you will see SDN for sure. And also we have to be aware of the word called as communications, how the communications happen, like the concepts of this DHCP, so VLANs, and those kind of stuff are very important to us when talking about network and communications. And moving to the compute part, actually I feel that that is one of the most important thing, because in the building block of cloud, one major part is compute, where we talk about the CPU capacity and memory capacity. And here team, the one keyword now, you must be very aware as called as a workload. So you must be aware of the word called as a workload. What is a workload in compute? That means you have a CPU utilization, you have a memory utilization. So how much is the workload running on top of it? How much is the applications or data which is running on that? How much is getting utilized from the compute, or compute capacity you have deployed, is very important for you to learn. And obviously how the cloud service provider is properly providing this compute capacity to the consumers or customers. Like, they have a mechanism called as a limits, reservation, and share. So these three concepts are very important, because as I said before, compute is something which is very very demanding, and customers need to get that as per their requirements.
And I want to add further to the Chris talk is when it comes to the network communication, as Chris told about SDN. See, in SDN, we have a control layer, we have an application layer, we have a, I think,
Infrastructure
application
layer.
layer, infrastructure layer. So you need to have a very good understanding about what is the function of each and every layer. Now, just for a reference as an example, I can say control layer is very critical layer, because if control layer is down, everything is down. There's a dedicated coffee short series I made on the SDN, introduction of SDN and SDN question bank. So you can refer that. That would be very useful. And when it comes to the compute part, as I said, you need to have a very good understanding about the metrics by which we manage the computes. Okay, share metrics, pool metrics, and all that. Now, when you say compute, compute is basically all about the computation of a RAM and CPU. So we basically allocate a RAM and CPU to the user, which is called as a each instance. So how much user should able to consume the instances, it is some depending upon the number of compute of RAM and CPU he has. So make sure he need to have a minimum RAM, we need to have a minimum CPU, we need to have maximum CPU, maximum RAM to prevent DOS attacks and all that. So from that point of view, you need to understand the security aspect of the computation also. And over to that part, virtualization, you need to have a very good understanding about the type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is more secure. Type 2 basically, type 1 is a hypervisor. Type 2 is basically your VMware workstations and all that. It come with the more functionality. So more functionality bring more threats. So type 1 and type 2, you need to have very good understanding. Then you need to also have a good understanding about the different threats and vulnerabilities associated on the hypervisor level, like VMs for all and
For sure.
VM hijacking and all that.
Yes.
Over to you, Krish.
Actually, yes, Prab, like the virtualization is one of the key topics, because when you go to a cloud platform, all the things are working on top of that virtualization kind of stuff. Because even if you see orchestration layer and everything is basically the part which is handled by the virtualization. And again, the difference is very important. Type 1 or bare metal, type 2 is hosted. So we have to understand the difference. And when you go to a cloud platform, the cloud service provider basically go for the type 1, that is a bare metal, because there is no underlying operating system for hosting the hypervisor. The hypervisor itself acts as the operating system. And that is one reason why the comparatively when you go for type 1 and type 2, type 1 is more secure because there is no OS. And the second reason is that when you go for a type 2, it is always limited. It's like a toy. It's just always limited. Like if you want to have like failover protection, if you want to have a DRS, if you want to have a VM migration, live VM migration, etc., it's not possible in type 2. Normally you have to go for type 1 for those kind of advanced features. So obviously that is one thing for sure we have to learn. And of course, as you said, threats are very important in virtualization, because what are the key threats in virtualization? For example, now there is something called as a VM escape, or we can call it as a host escape, or a hyperjacking. So whatever it is, these are all major threats in cloud computing. When you go for a virtualization layer, for sure we have to learn that. And definitely it is testable, because that is one of the most important building blocks of cloud computing. And the next thing is that we have something called the storage part. So the storage part, like
No,
normally
I'm sorry to interrupt here. One thing I would like to add here is a management plane also, because
Mhm.
management plane is also very, very important, because it is an interface by which you manage the entire infrastructures.
Exactly.
So one small suggestion from exam tip point of view is we can able to control the management plane by limiting and controlling the access, because it is can be the single point of failure, single point of access we have. So make sure you need to have a access based on a principle of least privilege. Make sure you should have a proper monitoring of the API by which you are integrating the management plane. And most important part in the management plane is basically how you want to give the access. So you need to make sure you should be enabled with multi-factor authentications and all that.
Indeed.
Over to you, Krish.
Yeah, actually, Prab, actually that is one major topic, because when you go to a cloud platform, this is one point which I see people get confused. When you
Hmm.
say management plane, there are two types of management plane. One is basically what the customer see as a management console in AWS or portal
Hmm.
in Azure, etc. That is in a customer perspective. Like the same way for a cloud service provider as well, for managing their internal operations, they have their own management plane in the virtualization. So either in the cloud provider side or customer side, the management plane plays a very important role, and we basically call it as a single point of failure. The reason why, because let's suppose that I go to AWS cloud platform or Azure cloud platform. I log into the cloud platform, I do any activity like storing or creating a VMs or whatever activity we are doing. All these things are mostly done to the management plane. So if
Hmm.
that is compromised, then the whole cloud infra can be completely, it's messed
Hmm.
up. Like for
Hmm.
example, if you go for organization now, everything, maybe the critical databases, data, and everything is access to the management plane. And if there is no proper separation of duties, if there is no multi-factor authentication, if there is no proper least privilege authorization like that, it can be a major threat for in cloud computing. And
Hmm.
if you see the CSA top threats, you will see that this management plane compromise is there in some formats every time, because that is one major threat we have. Still, people are not much aware of. So it's very important for us to learn for sure.
And what is your perspective on storage?
So storage part is basically very important to learn, because now you go to a cloud platform. So there are cloud service providers storing data in, like multiple, storage devices. So the
Hmm.
resilience and redundancy is very important for that. So that is the
Hmm.
reason why storage comes a key thing. So the first point to keep in mind is the cloud service provider never store your data in a single hard disk or single SSD. They have a massive cluster there where we basically organize into LUNs. They will organize into something called as a this data dispersion technology is there. So where that will, when you go for a cloud storage and store some data there, they will automatically make sure that the data get dispersed across multiple storage devices and managed accordingly. And
Hmm.
always keep one point in mind when talking about storage. Always remember the word called a storage controller. What is a
Hmm.
storage controller? Means that now you have a cluster of storage, and to
Hmm.
manage a cluster of storage, to issue the proper commands, to orchestrate them efficiently, we need to have a storage controller.
Hmm.
Like we have a RAID controller, we have iSCSI controller, etc. So controller is very important for storage.
And one more important thing you need to understand is from a cloud service provider point of view, they are responsible for managing the security of their structures, whereas you as a customer responsible for data security in the cloud. So only one of the most effective way you can able to secure the data in the cloud is encryption. Even you lost your disk, you lost your cloud provider, still you can able to maintain the persistent security. So in cloud environment, you lose control of physical medium where the data is stored, but you can still retain the responsibility, security, and privacy data by having a encryption in place. Okay, so that's why we use a crypto shedding technology to destroy the data in the cloud and maintaining a security in the data in the cloud. So any question talk about data security in the cloud, answer is encryption. Correct me if I'm wrong, Krish.
Exactly. Effective encryption is very important for them for sure.
And one more important thing at the basic level, CSP responsible for the physical protection of data center and storage infrastructure that they contain, while the customer is responsible for the logical security and privacy of data that store in the CSP environment. And CSP also responsible for the security and you can say security patches and maintenance of the data storage technology and other services they provide, while the customer is responsible for the properly configuring using the storage pools and everything. So
Exactly.
that's something we need to understand, and we provide the service as per the SLAs.
Exactly. And indeed, team, like, what, like Prab said, I want to, stress that point on more, very important. When talking about physical security, it's always a responsibility of cloud service provider. When
Mm.
talking about data security, the legal liability of the securing data will always be with the customer, whether you're using IaaS or PaaS or SaaS, whatever it is, the data security liability will be coming to you only. That is very important for your system.
Governance and liability, yeah. And one
Exactly.
more important thing in the management plane, RBAC or ABAC access we can have. Root access only in the case if you want to manage something. Otherwise, if any access need to be given for the basic access, give the user base access, because that is how you can able to protect against the abuse of principle of least privilege.
100%. Yes, that's very important for sure.
Okay. So for your reference, those who are not aware of management plane, the best example you can say AWS management console by which you launch the machines. Then we have a Cisco also, they have the our interface panel by which they launch the machine. So that is a perfect example we have.
Exactly.
Now moving to the next part, which is called as a design a secure data center. Okay, so when you're talking about design, yes, Krish, you want to start? first?
Actually, this is basically very interesting. I can see they have given a lot of importance to this particular module, because
Mm,
when talking about logical design, in fact, that is one major part which we have more than physical design of data center when you go to a
mm,
cloud platform. The reason is because now I'm a cloud service provider who want to provide a service to my consumer. So I want
mm,
to make sure that what kind of services I want to provide, do I am I providing it to the customers across the globe, or
mm.
basically is it for only people within a particular country, like that. So logical design must be very properly defined, like talking about tenant partitioning, like how the customers are going to be segregated, how the data is basically going to have an access control, how we can basically provision the deployment activities there. So all these things are the part of the logical design, and that must be considered first, and based on that only the cloud service provider go for a physical design.
One thing I want to add here with the Krish continuation is that, when we're talking about logical design, so here what we need to also understand is when you're designing, you need to see how the access management need to work, how the monitoring for compliance need to be achieved, how the regulatory requirement need to be attained, patch management, log capture analysis. So all factors need to be considered when you design. The until unless you don't design, you cannot have a physical design. So logical design, that's why it's very important. And most important thing in the logical design you need to consider is all services need to be standardized, and
Exactly.
it should be it must be reviewed and approved for the use by the organization. So this is how you can involve the change management, configuration management process when you're designing the data center. See, this section is basically all about you work for the cloud provider and they are providing a services, or you're working for the company, those who have their own data center and they want to run their own services in their own data center, and they need to have their own private cloud. So from that point of view, we're covering here is logical design.
Exactly.
And any kind of a deviation you want in a logical design configurations and all that, it need to go through a change management process and exception process, which we can able to track. Over to you, Grish.
Exactly. That is about the logical design team. Indeed, it's a very important thing for sure, first of all. Then we have a physical design. We are talking about the location of data center and building or buying. So when talking about location of data center, always keep in mind, team, it's about, we have multiple factors must be considered while choosing a location of data center, including the, like whether they are have the place we are choosing is prone to natural disasters, some kind of riots happening, or maybe something a place where we have a more humidity or more more temperature. So we have to plan a proper location which have a balance of all the things. It's not like we have to go for the coldest place in the planet, or we have to go for the hottest place. We want to make sure that we have a proper choose a proper location based on our requirements, where we have accessibility, we have all the supplies needed for us, the power supply and all this kind of stuff. And the second thing is that building or buying, that's a very important testable point. The reason is because when you go for data center, there are two options we have. Either we can buy a data center or lease a data center, and we can build a data center. So when you basically buy, the problem is that you have a lack of design inputs. Like that means that now you're planning to use a predefined data center given by someone, or you're trying to lease a data center. That means that you have to settle with what there is by default there, or they have how it is built. When you go for building a data center, you can have a lot of options for adding your ideas and basically customize it as per your requirements while you're building. And to add with this, one more very critical area which I feel is called as a MDC, or modular data center. Team, that is very important. There is a word called as a modular data center, where now previously what happens is that we build a data center, we are using it for a long term, but now whatever we are building, it's not for next 10 years we are keeping it. So we have to keep on upgrading it, or basically it must be agile. So that is the reason why now companies prefer something called as a MDC, or modular data center, where we will be able to replace the data center as a we can build data center like a containers modules, and we can plug it in to our existing data center, and we can always replace it as per our requirements. If you Google the word called as modular data center, you will see a lot of pictures on that, and it looks very interesting. And now most of the cloud service providers want to adopt that model called as a MDC, modular data center, which allows future expansion also.
And with continuation of that, one thing I would like to tell you here, team, when you're talking about the physical design, is the responsibility of the owner of the cloud data center.
Sure.
And this is generally a cloud vendor or CSP we have. And physical design consideration, when you're talking about, okay, we have to see how the things need to be done, but it is always a complex, and we have a multiple parameters when we considering the physical design, like location where you want to keep the data center,
Mhm.
because multiple location for data center recommendation when you're designing on-prem data center, but also so costly as organization do not utilize them. So one thing we need to understand here is, how the multiple data center locations you need to have, review the legal regulatory requirement, can we have a data center in that location. Then you have to take a choice whether you want to build or buy. Definitely, many business decisions come down to a fundamental question: is better to build or better to buy? because build is basically expensive, better is basically, sorry, build is expensive, buy is cost effective. Build basically having a higher capex over the opex, whereas the buy having a higher opex over the capex. We have a multiple parameters when we deciding when we need to go for build and buy. Okay, legal, regulatory, governance, data security, control. So you need to consider these factors, but it is completely depending upon the business decision, because by end of the day, it is a business who are going to invest money on that. Third part, which is called as a environmental design. Environmental design, like a physical design data center, it is a responsibility of the CSP. Okay, and it is very important to have a good environment design, because if you have a good environment design, you can able to sustain a data center more effectively, you can able to process your data more effectively, you can able to run your cloud services more effectively. So environment design should be defined according to vendor standards, so that something is there. So over to you, Krish, do you, if you wish to add some pointers into that.
Exactly what you said, Prab. Like, that is also very important, where we have to understand about the need of adequate temperature management. Like, the temperature, humidity, and everything must be very important. And what is the importance of proper, air conditioning there? How this air conditioning can be done? Like, what is the proportion of that? How, like, how much more effective? How much more the ventilation or the or the air intake you are having, that much effective? You can basically optimize the cost of this thing. And also, you have to understand the concept of multi-vendor pathway connectivity, where we're talking about having a resilient connectivity from different vendors to provide a service. Because, as I said, like, you are going for a cloud service provider, and the cloud service provider is relying on another vendor, like maybe some ISP or someone who is giving them connectivity. And if that goes down, obviously your cloud service provider can also go down. So that's the reason why they have to opt for something called as a multi-vendor pathway connectivity. And that connect to the last point called as design resilient also. That means whenever you're building a data center, or maybe buying or building a data center, you have to make sure that the resiliency is a primary thing, because single point of failures must not exist when you build a data center. You have to make sure that, because you're providing service to a massive number of customers who is handling sensitive data there. So obviously, as a cloud service provider, we have to make sure that there is a resiliency by default whenever we are designing a data center, and there must not be a single point of failure.
And that is the reason is, if you're looking up for the resiliency in the data center, it means continuous service even in the case of downtime. You need to have a multiple power units from a different vendors, multiple internet services from a different vendor, so if one service is down, we can use other. So we need to avoid the single point of failure when we talk about designing resiliency and all that. And if you want to check, suppose you are a customer and you want to see whether AWS provider or Microsoft basically provider have a appropriate environmental control like HVAC, fire suppression, other systems and all that, you can basically ask for the SOC 2 report, which is very important for you to understand from an exam point of view. Utilization of a SOC 2 with the reference of designing a data center is very, very important. So there is a coffee short series I made also on the SOC 2. If you type prep SOC 2 report, you will get that video in which I have covered some of the question which is mapped with the SOC 2 reports.
Exactly, that's very important.
And one more important thing, do you have any suggestions about the design resilient apart from having load balancers and all that? Like when you're talking about resilient design, we take into the multiple physical and environmental, you can say, aspects we have, including your electrical powers, HVAC,
Exactly.
human occupation and design practices like natural heating and cooling alternative that minimize the reliance on electric power HVAC. So these principles can be applied at a single building or as a community. So
Exactly.
resiliency is something is a foundation for data center we have, because data center is driven on the cloud and cloud is basically on the availability.
Exactly.
Now we are in
And
yeah, sorry.
And I just want to add one more thing. So we have forgot to discuss about the Uptime Institute. That's a very important
Very, very important.
team, guaranteed in it's a guaranteed topic you have to keep in mind, because when talking about the word called as Uptime Institute, okay, that is super important. Like, there is a
Yeah.
multiple standards by ISO is there, Uptime Institute is providing and all these things, because Uptime is the leader in the designing of data center. Like, as per the Uptime Institute, there are so 4 tiers of data center. We have a tier 1, we have a tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4. So you have to learn these 4 tiers for sure. And the scenarios are very important to understand, because when we you go for tier 1, when we go for tier 2, when we go for, it's very
I
important
agree.
for us to understand. And
Especially tier 4. So
exactly,
if you
especially
take
tier 4.
example in a case of healthcare,
Mhm.
medical services, maximum availability answer is tier 4.
Maximum tier 4, exactly. That's
Yeah,
the key
so
important.
99.995 is the percentage we have. So keep that principle in your mind when you're preparing for the CCSP. And Uptime Institute is very important because it is the standard which talk about the topology of how to build the data center with the maximum availability.
For sure.
So in this way, like example, I'm working as a cloud architect and I want to build data center, and I don't know how to maintain the maximum availability with the maximum resources. So this is how we are basically using the factors like Uptime Institute, which give us a baseline benchmark. If you bring these things, by this you can have a this much amount of availability.
For sure.
So that is how you can able to build the things.
Exactly. That is very important, team. Like, Uptime Institute is going to be critical in the exam as well, because means it's there for a long time, and basically now also people are using it, because like, even if we have standards for ISO and all, Uptime is the most leader, because like if you go to AWS, just want to add one more point. If you go to AWS, etc., you will find that they are still referring to Uptime Institute, even though they are not certified. They are still referring to Uptime Institute because they are the leaders in the standard. And last but not least, when you go for Uptime Institute, if you go to their website, you will get the precise definitions of each tiers. Like if you search for Uptime Institute tier architecture in the official website of Uptime Institute, you will see there is a document which is clearly mentioning about 4 tiers, and in each tier what is resilient, what is not resilient. They will clearly tell you that, and that is the best reference I have seen for this Uptime Institute standard, for sure.
Great. So next is basically called as a analyze risk associated with the cloud infrastructure platform. So Krish, what is your perspective on this?
Obviously, team, when you talk about the risk in the cloud platform, the first point to keep in mind is that whatever risk you have in the on-premises, you have in the cloud as well, for sure. Even if there are some risk you're transferring to the cloud service provider, but at the end of the day, it's also a data center when you go to the cloud platform. So obviously, that risk is there. Plus, it adds you with a lot more risk, including lack of location understanding, multi-tenancy, third-party administrators. Like, the risk is added a lot on this. And one major thing is that the whole risk assessment process is something which you have to learn, and very critical for you to understand it for the exam perspective as well. Because from starting from the risk identification, then analyzing the risk, understanding the level of risk, and basically risk mitigation mechanisms we can have, what is residual risk. So whatever you have regarding the risk, you have to learn this for sure. And those risks which are specific to the cloud also you have to learn for sure, because like when talking about multi-tenancy is a very important risk, as I said before. Like, we have multiple risks, you have to learn for sure. And what are the common mitigation strategies we can have for each of them as well?
Yeah, so when you're talking about risk assessment, risk assessment start with identification, then we talk about identify asset threats and vulnerability, then we talk about way of analyzing the level of impact, which is called qualitative and quantitative, and then we have a treatment, acceptance, transfer, avoidance, and mitigation. One thing I would suggest is whenever we're doing a risk assessment, risk tolerance is a current risk we talk about, and we need to make sure risk tolerance is below the appetite level. And any kind of initiative you want to do in the company, we have to start with a risk assessment only. If you want to discontinue any services, you have to do risk assessment only. So when you're talking about the cloud common risk, like we have a geographical dispersion of CSP risk. Example, like I'm using AWS or I'm using Microsoft Azure. I'm concerned about will they keep data in other countries and all that. So geographical dispersion of CSP data center, that is a one risk we talk about. Then downtime is another impact. Then we have a compliance issues. Then we have a general technology risk. Okay, so you need to have a very good clarity about these areas. Then when you're talking about the vulnerabilities part, as Krish already covered, then we talk about the risk mitigation strategy. Start with the documentation, governance, and everything. Then we work on the procedure part. So that is how you can able to mitigate the risk, which is basically identifying the cloud. Over to you, Krish. So we have a next part which is called plan and
And
implementation of a
of
security
security control.
control. So yeah.
Indeed, like that's also, as I said, like it's this domain. The reason why people say that this domain is tough, because again, these kind of topics are coming in, because
Mm.
like talking about physical and protect. So basically, what are the key factors they can use to protect the physical infrastructure? Like what are the controls they can have for their physical data center they are having, and basically what are the protection factors? And team, when talking about physical protection of data center, and basically the data and security, one major thing is that people is very important, because
People
uh,
safety.
people safety is very important for us to understand for sure. That is most important part. The second thing is that SOD, separation of duties, is very important. Like, I'll give an example. Now, a few years back, you may have heard about one of the top providers leaked 1 million people's key files one of the employee of a major cloud service provider leaked 1 million customer key files just because he's angry, just because of no reason he just leaked it. So that's the reason why SOD is very important, that one person must not be able to do all the activity, and there must be thorough background verification before appointing any people for data center. That is very important to understand. Then obviously talking about the, securing the data transfer and also is very important. Then identification, authentication, authorization in cloud is also important. Like we are talking about the cloud authentication, where you must understand that multi-factor authentication is the most important thing, and you also have to learn about the concept of zero trust model. Because what happens now, previously, when we talk about legacy security and all, we only talk about multi-factor authentication, and we thought it's very much secure. The first point to keep in mind is that MFA is not at all secure, but it's comparatively much more better than having a single factor authentication. That's the first point. The second point is that now one major thing which we adopt is called as a zero trust model, and the major principle is never trust, always verify. We have to verify everything even after we have allowed to authenticate. That's very important part we have to keep in mind. And obviously, authorization is basically a part of the journey from the scratch. Indeed, like you have to make sure that you get the proper minimum level of permission, exactly the bare minimum level of permission, the least privilege for a person to do his job. If you give anything more than that, it is going to be a threat for your business.
And with continuation with that, when I'm talking about the physical and environmental protection, when you say the primary consideration, the primary consideration is a site location. Okay, it will have an impact on both physical and environmental protection. So data center along with their waterfront in the area subject to the regular hurricane or flooding is likely to be routinely damaged by this threat. So make sure when you're talking about the physical location, we need to consider two aspects. One is called as environmental protection, physical protection. And risk associated with the cloud computing, when I say, it can be implemented with the proper controls. Okay, so if you have a same proper control for the physical security, we can able to attain the utmost security also. So customer does not have a control of the physical environmental protection. It is a responsibility of the cloud provider. That's the most important thing. But when it comes to the system storage and communication protection, start with the policy. If you need to first have a policy about how to manage the security of the system, what is the security we have for the storage. Make sure storage should be isolated. So if you as a cloud provider selling a dedicated private cloud as services, to make sure your storage, one storage tenant should be isolated from other. And if you think that, okay, from a customer point of view, provider is sharing your storage with others also, so make sure you should have a proper encryption in place by which you can able to secure. Along with that, in order to access something, we also need to have protection against the DOS. Boundary protection should be there. Cryptography need to be have by which you can able to manage the data security in the cloud model.
Exactly.
But we also need to understand about the identification, authentication, authorization.
Yes.
Over to you, Krish.
Exactly, that is what we discussed now, Prab. Like like you said, this AAA authentication, authorization, accountability is very important when you go to a cloud platform. In fact, as we have a management console and those kind of stuff, they're adding the risk level. So obviously, that is a major thing which we have to keep in mind. And finally, team, we talk about the audit mechanisms. So how do I basically ensure all these things? How do I verify all these things are working properly as expected? And just one more thing to add with this, because recently I have seen in the new textbooks and all, basically that when talking about the cloud platform, or basically when talking about security, it's not only about the implementation. We have to also basically verify the control effectiveness. That's also very important. So we have to make sure there is a proper log correlation, log collection, packet capture, and all to make sure that things are working properly as expected, and basically whatever we are implementing is giving us a proper fruit. That's it.
And if you want to establish a strong accountability, you need to have a strong authentication.
Exactly.
Because otherwise, if your user account is not configured or protect with authentication, anyone can use your account and able to access the resources. So it's very important. You need to have a proper authentication in place, multi-factor authentication for your APIs or cloud management plane. And if you take example of identification, like example, I went to airport and say, hey, my name is Prab and I'm traveling to Dubai. So my name is Prab. So they will see my name in the list. That's called identification. Then I will show my Aadhaar card or passport just to prove I'm the same person who claimed to be. That is called authentication. And then they give me a seat number 35. That is an authorization. But make sure I'm the right person who claimed to be, required authentication. So authentication also have a 3 factor: something you know, something you have, and something you are. So that is how we try to validate.
Yes.
Coming back to the audit mechanism, before Krish says something, I want to add one point. It's very, very important is when it comes to audit, we are collecting a logs. Sometimes what happens, we're collecting a log from a different source. make sure we should have a common timestamp. NTP should be configure, new time protocol, network time protocol should be configure, and make sure all systems should be synced with the common timestamp and all that. If you have a common timestamp, it is easy for us to correlate the event. So that is also very important topic from exam point of view. It's very important to have a proper timestamp by which you can able to correlate the logs and you can able to get the visibility. Over to you, Krish.
Exactly. That's just why I want to add also. Like, team, just think about a log file you're having without a proper timestamp. It is never, useful for us. So that is the reason why having a proper time server in your infrastructure to synchronize between the different log files and all these things are very important. Even if your SIM tool want to work also as expected, definitely timestamp is very important. That is unavoidable for sure. That's it.
And make sure it should be tuned properly so it can able to collect the relevant data which is required as per the business functions, right?
Exactly.
Now, next point what we have is basically called as a business continuity. Yes, Krish. Business continuity deal with the continuity of the business. It is a strategic plan which talk about how to sustain the business in the case of disaster, and DR is basically part of the BCP, right?
Exactly. Team, this part, like the reason why, even Prabhal's laughed is because, when you go for CISSP or CCSP or any kind of programs like that, this, or in fact when you talk about cloud, especially now, this is going to be one of the most major concern for every organization, because at the end of the day we work for the business and we want to make sure that we can provide the proper service to my customers without interruption. We can ensure that the service continuity must be there. So obviously BCDR is something which needs a lot of preparation, lot of planning and all this kind of stuff. And especially when coming to the cloud platform, we have one more guy called as a cloud service provider in picture. So obviously this makes a major topic in the exam for sure. And starting with this team, like you must know the exact process of how the BCDR works, like from the point of a like the business impact analysis, the risk assessment, then like proper control. So you must know how to plan a proper BCDR strategy. So always keep one point in mind when talking about your business continuity as an organization. You have to ensure that you select the proper cloud services based on your BCDR requirements. For example, if you go to a cloud platform where you have multiple cloud storages with different level of availability, and also you choose the proper cloud storage based on your business continuity requirements you're having. How much is the downtime you can maximum tolerate? So what is your RTO, what is your RPO, everything you like, these terms are going to be critical. Team, RTO, RPO, WRT, MTD, service levels, these are going to be very important for us to test in the, or it is testable in the exam for sure. And obviously having a proper business continuity plan which basically defines all the business dependencies, having a proper understanding of the roles of the like who will start the plan, who is responsible for this. So all this is also very important. Just to add with that one more point on this, like when talking about BCDR of the data center of the cloud platform, it's always the cloud service provider's responsibility. But when talking about your data and your deployments on the cloud platform, you have to make sure you plan it accordingly by having proper timely backups based on your RPO and other factors.
And if you talk about the BCP process, you want to know. So there is a one video I made on BCP process. If you type BCP Prabnar, you will get that video. Along with that, there's a coffee shot is there. See, in cloud point of view, we are using cloud as a secondary site. Okay, so we have a different scenarios. Example, if my existing data center is down, I can switch to the cloud provider. So here the cloud provider is considered as a extended support for me. But when I go for that kind of a solution, I need to check the integration, I need to look for the portability, I need to look for the interoperability. So these are areas which can be testable. So what are the areas you need to check? Because during a disaster, if you're trying to migrate the service, there's a possibility service might fail. So you need to see, we need to have a limited impact. Then apart from that, we also need to understand other scenario, like moving from one provider to another provider. So we need to have a more integration APIs. Okay, BIA is the critical component of the BCP. If you want to prioritize which is critical, it is done through BIA only. In the BIA, the first step is identify the business, analyze the impact, calculate the MTD, RTO, and RPO. MTD is the acceptable downtime. RTO is the time it takes to restore the services. RPO is the maximum data loss we have. So you need to have a very good understanding of these areas. Okay. MTD is determined by the business owner. RTO determined the operation team. RPO defined by the business team. RP talk about the backup strategy. So these are things are important. Apart from that, when you basically create a plan, you need to test the plan. And ultimate objective of test the plan is to update the plan, guide the plan, not to train the people. And more effective will be the test is more realistic test. If you can do, you can get the better visibility. Over to you, Krish.
Exactly, Prab. Like just to add what you said, like team, when you're talking about this BCDR, always keep one point in mind when you go to the cloud platform. First thing is that ensuring the continuity within the same provider. Like now you're going to a cloud service provider, how can I basically plan my proper business continuity within this that particular provider itself? Like how do I choose the proper services, how do I ensure the BCPDR in the same provider itself? And now what happens if the whole provider goes down? How do I continue my business if the whole provider goes down? What happens if there is outage for the whole cloud service provider? That is the second scenario which we have to keep in mind. The third point is that we can have it in three ways. Like these are basically testable in the exam for sure. There are three ways with this there. First is basically talking about the on-premise and cloud as BCDR, where we talk about we have on-premises data center as the primary and cloud as secondary, or the DR site. Then we have a same provider BCDR. That means where we have a primary provider as a AWS, and the backup provider is also AWS, but we use in a different, like different zones or different regions. Then we have a alternate provider BCDR, where we talk about two different cloud service provider, one as primary and one as backup. So these three scenarios will be testable in the exam for sure. You must always learn that in depth.
Excellent. So, as I said, most robust level of testing is a full cutover test, and in this test, the actual step taken for disaster recovery are performed, and primary system is disconnected, and the business attempt to run the critical function. That is the most important thing. So, when we're talking about the overall goals, overall planning, and all that, testing is most important to update the plan. So, this is all from our side.
But just
Yeah,
one more thing I want to add, team. Like if you want to pay for CCSP or CSP, etc., this BCPDR is a critical topic you have to learn for
exactly.
sure. And team, refer to that video. Like as Prab said, you can just go to YouTube and type Prab Nair BCPDR, because you will be able to get that whole concepts there, because that is unavoidable when you go for any exam talking about a business technology and these kind of BCDR scenarios. It will be there in the exam for sure, because that's mandatory. We have to understand properly.
And one more important thing, some common fundas you need to remember is moving to the cloud is a business decision, not a security decision. Cloud environment often native with a high availability resiliency at a price that is attractive to business. One of the biggest reason of going for the cloud is availability. And looking for the active on maximum availability, you need to have a multiple redundant systems. And to achieve this benefit, customer should have understanding of the infrastructure piece. Along with that, customer is responsible for data security. Physical security lies with the cloud provider, and that need to be addressed in the contract. And firstly, the customer must understand how to properly configure and use the cloud resources, so they can able to purchase and ensure the appropriate control is in place. So these are some of the important fundamentals we have. Uptime Institute is very important, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. Along with that, fault tolerance, redundant solutions, resiliencies, these are important areas that you need to work on it. Risk management, different type of cloud risk we have. Okay, so these are things which you need to refer. So I believe this is all from our side, and we're looking forward for the domain 4 session also soon. And do let me know in the comment box what is the next video shall I made with Krish, and how do you find this session? Your feedbacks really matter for us, and because of you guys, we are here, and we really appreciate our gladiators seeing these videos, and I'm sure it will be providing a great success in your life. Thank you, team. Over
Thank
to
you
you,
so
Krish.
much. Thank you so much, team. The same. It's a pleasure for me